So let's jump right into this and talk about how did we even get here? How did we get to life under slavery in the 18th century? And there's really a couple things to know about. First, that trip from Africa over to the colonies or over to where the slave trade was taking place in the Caribbean. That's known as the Middle Passage. It's a horribly dangerous trip. If you've seen the movie Amistad, which is based on a real-life slave ship, it really depicts quite graphically just how horrendous of a trip that was, what Africans were put through on that ship as far as being treated basically like they were animals, being chained up, served hardly any food, having to sleep in extremely dangerous close quarters with no use of bathroom facilities. And again, this trip, because we're not talking about planes or anything that can go at super fast speeds, we're talking about a ship in which they're going to be on it from anywhere from a few weeks to over a month, living in these conditions. And then obviously once they get to the colonies, their life's conditions aren't going to get any better because they will be enslaved. But that Middle Passage is that first part of the journey from Africa over to the colonies. Jamestown in Virginia in 1619, that's when we first see the introduction of African slaves. For a while in the colonies, Native Americans were being used as slaves, and we also had the indentured servants that weren't technically slaves, right? Because indentured servants were choosing to enter into that lifestyle. You were signing a contract to get a free ticket over to the colonies. And a lot of people try to compare indentured servants and slaves, and you really can't compare the two. Not saying indentured servants had a great life, because they also worked in hard conditions, but they were choosing that life, right? Because they were getting a free trip over. And so it was definitely much different than when we talk about slavery itself. We're really going to see slavery increase in the colonies when Bacon's Rebellion takes place in 1676. Anyone who's out there tonight, does anyone remember or want to give us a quick refresher as to what Bacon's Rebellion was all about, or even just shout out the colony in which it took place? Write out, I should say, not shout out. Sorry, my cats are going to constantly be jumping on me this whole time. So Bacon's Rebellion, again, indentured servants were being used a great deal. This is going to take place in Virginia. And we're just going to see poor farmers really be getting angry with Governor Berkeley of Virginia, and the fact that he's really doing things to help the wealthy farmers, but not the poor farmers per se. And a lot of this had to do with Native American conflict that was taking place in Virginia. And so Bacon is going to lead this rebellion against Berkeley. And what we see end up happening because of this rebellion, an unintended consequence, is the fact that we're going to see colonies like Virginia and some of the other southern colonies turn away from using indentured servants and turn more towards using African slaves as a means of labor. And so that's why Bacon's Rebellion is so important when it does come to slavery. Bringing us into the formation of our country, we see slavery being discussed in multiple ways at our Constitutional Convention. So we see this first with the Three-Fifths Compromise. Just a refresher, the Three-Fifths Compromise was that compromise that was reached that talked about how slaves would be counted towards the population of a state. If you recall, with the way our House of Representatives works, the amount of representatives you have per state is based on population. So there was this great debate within Congress, especially between the northern and the southern states, over whether or not slaves would be counted towards the southern population. The North, of course, was like, heck no, because that's going to give the Southerners more of a population, which in turn will give them more representatives. And then you had the Southerners who obviously wanted to count them. So the compromise that was reached was that slaves would count as 3/5 of the population. And they would use that to accumulate their population totals for the amount of representatives that they would have in Congress. We're also going to see that at the Constitutional Convention, they talk about the fact that Congress, our new government, won't be allowed to do anything to the slave trade until 1808. So that means for the next few years, they can't touch it. Even when they do decide to put an end to the slave trade, that's just the external slave trade. That means bringing more Africans in. We're going to see, because slavery doesn't end right until after the Civil War, we're going to see we have a huge chunk of time where our internal slave trade is going to be taking place and going to be quite strong, especially down within the South, and then moving into some of those Western territories. And then we also see in our Constitution, there is a Fugitive Slave Act, which talks about the fact that should a slave escape, the ramifications for that slave, and then also the ramifications for anyone who is trying to help that slave escape. Before I continue on to the next slide, are there any questions I can answer from anyone? I'm just going to switch slides here, but again, if you want to ask any questions, please feel free. Okay, so just moving on, you know, as far as what's going on as far as slavery in the North, a lot of times what we saw happening in the North, especially after the Constitutional Convention, was this idea of graduated emancipation. And this really got started in Pennsylvania. They're the first state to do it, and then we see other states pick it up as well. So the whole idea of graduated emancipation is the fact that you're not going to allow to be able to bring any new slaves into Pennsylvania. So again, they're the first state, so I'm just going to use them as an example. You can't bring any new slaves into Pennsylvania. All children of slaves would be considered free. And then people who were currently slaves in Pennsylvania, once they passed away, then slavery would basically be non-existent in Pennsylvania. So the whole idea was that gradually slavery was going to come to an end in Pennsylvania. We also see in the North that Northwest Ordinance. So again, at this point in time, when we're talking about the Northwest portion of our country, think today, if you look at that map, what today we refer to as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is huge for a few reasons, but the one we're going to focus on as far as this stream is related to is the fact that that Northwest Ordinance outlaws slavery, okay? And that's the first time that we see full-fledged outlawing of slavery. Now, these are territories at this point. They're not states, but that's still huge because that's the first time that's going to happen. This is Frankie, who just decided to join us here. Now, again, let's talk about the South. So this is really what the focus of our stream is tonight. I'm talking about the antebellum South. Antebellum, just because you'll see this word quite often on your AP exam, just know that that refers to prior to the Civil War. That's kind of what they're talking about when they say that. So the South at this time is very reliant upon the farming lifestyle, otherwise known as the agrarian lifestyle. It's an agrarian society. There are multiple crops that are huge cash crops for them, one of them being tobacco, which was one of the first ones when the colonies got started. And then another one that's becoming really huge is going to be cotton during this time period. We're going to see that the South lacks industrialization. So it's those northern states, especially along the East Coast, that are developing industries and factories. But in the South, they're solely focusing on farming. And we're going to see that their money is solely really going to be invested into slave labor. Instead of taking their money and trying to invest it into other industries, they're taking their money and investing it in slave labor. 25% of the population in the South is going to own slaves. So that's interesting when you think about it, right? That means a majority of Southerners were not slave owners. But even though a majority of Southerners were not slave owners, Southern whites still supported and defended the institution of slavery. So whether you owned a slave or you did not own a slave and you lived in the South, you were in support of the institution of slavery. Reason being, if you own slaves, you support slavery because that's free, cheap labor for you, right? And you're making money off of the backs of slaves. If you don't own slaves and you lived in the South, for the most part, you still support slavery because you were hopeful that maybe one day you would have enough money to own a slave, right? You're probably a poor Southern farmer if you don't own a slave, but the hope is that one day you'll own enough to own a slave. But also, even if you don't have enough money one day to own a slave, you still support slavery because that means there's somebody in society who is lower than you. And for a lot of people, that made a huge difference. And this is where we see this entire idea of racism really come about. The fact that white Southerners felt higher than slaves in Southern society. So owning a slave, not owning a slave didn't matter. It still actually made you feel better about yourself to have slaves in your society, because that meant that someone was going to be lower than you. Southern politics is also, in a large way, going to be influential as to slavery during this time period, right? So states have all different legislatures, right? So Georgia will have their own legislature, Virginia, all of that. And what we see is that most of the people who are being elected to Southern legislatures tend to be wealthy plantation owners. So it's in the wealthy plantation owners' best interest to continue to vote on laws that will support slavery. So a lot of people say that Southern politics was almost like an oligarchy, right? Because an oligarchy means government by the few wealthy. And that's basically what we're seeing down south. That's these Southern large slaveholders who are basically controlling Southern politics at this point in time. Any questions before I flip? I'm just going to flip, but again, if you have questions, I can take a break from talking and answer those questions for you. All right, so just to break down what Southern society looked like at this point in time. So Southern society, you had your plantation owners, right? So your plantation owners would be that 25% of the population who tended to own slaves. The majority of this is under, okay, good question, Libby. Thank you for asking a question. So a lot of this, yes, is under Jackson's presidency, but this is also prior to his presidency and then even after. We're actually going to see, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about like Eli Whitney and the invention of the cotton gin. Jackson comes into office in 1824. He leaves in 1832. We're actually going to see slavery increase even more after his presidency. And there were a lot of slaves prior to his presidency. So yeah, Jackson was definitely president during 8 years of this time. But we're going to see that the presidents before him and the presidents after him, also slavery was very much a huge factor in our country. Henry Clay is going to be one of those Congress people who throughout this time period, he was constantly trying to work on compromises to keep our country together. And we're going to talk about some of those, like the Missouri Compromise and different things like that that are going to take place. But Southern society, we break it down. We have our plantation owners, right? So our plantation owners were the folks who had the large plantations, hundreds of acres of land, and so therefore a lot of them tended to own hundreds of slaves each. After your plantation owners, you would have your small slaveholders. So these are folks who couldn't own that many slaves. Their parcels of land weren't as big as a plantation, but they still had money to own a couple slaves. Then you would have what were known as your yeoman farmers. Your yeoman farmers are your smaller farmers. They're the majority of the population. They don't have money to own slaves, but they're that group I was talking about before who, even though they do not own slaves, they're still very much in favor of slavery because, again, it means they can view someone as being lower in society than them. And then finally would be your people, the Pine Barrens. The people of the Pine Barrens are kind of the people who live out in the woods, the area that's really not been developed at this point in time. There's not much farming there, but there's enough for them to sustain themselves and live off the land. Now, again, your yeoman farmers, your people of the Pine Barrens, they're the two groups of people who own no slaves. Your Pine Barrens folks really don't even own land. They're kind of just moving constantly throughout the woods and living off the land as they go. If we can contrast that to what society looked like in the North, you had a much more bustling society, right? Because you had factories growing in the North. Most immigrants who were coming to the United States were settling in the North. It was much easier for them to find jobs in the North. So you didn't see a lot of immigration going to the South, which meant the Northern society, Northern culture was becoming much more diverse. We also saw up in the north, you tended to have more public schooling, right? So there's a better education system in the north, where you actually saw towns providing free public schooling only up until 8th grade. So keep that in mind. At this point in time, high school wasn't really in existence as far as free public schooling was concerned. It only went to 8th grade at this point. But in the South, you didn't have that. In the South, your plantation owners would sometimes send their kids off as apprentices, maybe over to Europe, or they would just bring private tutors onto their plantations. If you're a yeoman farmer or you're a person living in the Pine Barrens and you had children, they weren't being educated. They were working right alongside you in the fields. So public schooling wasn't a big thing in the South like we saw it up north. And that's going to make a huge difference when we talk about societies. As far as Southern population is concerned, if you go to deep South states, so if we're looking at South Carolina and Georgia, which at this point are our southernmost states, a majority of their population was actually African. So they had a majority African population living in Georgia and South Carolina. If you go up to Virginia and Delaware, where you're getting closer to where the northern end of our country, you did have some free Black Americans living in Virginia and Delaware, not many. Definitely more so in Delaware than in Virginia, but it's just important to understand there were some free Black Americans who were living there. And then just African American communities in general, looking at what the population was in the North and in the South. So the African American population in the North was about 250,000 free Africans living in the North. A lot of times now, as much as they're free in the North, it doesn't mean that they're living a completely free lifestyle. They still had to face discrimination and racism, not as much as they would have in the South, but still important to understand things weren't perfect for them in the North. And a lot of times you would see African Americans and Irish, because at this point in time, Irish, a lot of them are also coming in and pouring into the North, and the Irish are being very much discriminated against as they come over. And so a lot of times in the North, African Americans and the Irish tended to be the two lower groups in society. There's a very famous political cartoon of a scale where you have an Irishman sitting on one side of the scale and then an African American gentleman sitting on another side of the scale. And the cartoon is commenting on how they're both equally low in society. As far as the free Black population in the South, it's important, again, to understand all African Americans who are living in the South are not slaves. For the most part, they are slaves, but there is a free population living in the South. The folks who are freely living in the South, many had gained their freedom. So they might have gained their freedom because there were some slave owners who, when they passed away in their will, they would set their slaves free. There were some slave owners who, even while they were alive, would set their slaves free. Very rare instances. I don't want you to think that this was common practice, because it was not. Some African Americans who are living in the South had a white father. And so if your father was white, but your mom was a Black slave, that would allow you to gain freedom. And so for a big part, that's why we do see some free Africans in the South. Some were able to pay for their freedom. But again, even though they were free in a sense, we use this word free in a restrictive sense, they still had a lot of restrictions on their daily life. They had a lot of restrictions about the movement they could do around Southern society. So just keep in mind, yes, there were some free Africans living in the South who were not considered slaves, but there weren't many jobs for them. A lot of times they would become the yeoman farmers or live in the Pine Barrens. And there were a lot of restrictions as to what they could do or how they could move around in society. I'm going to just switch, take a quick drink, give you all a second if you have a question to ask questions. Okay, so as far as the South is concerned, it is considered King Cotton in the sense that The economy was very much reliant, Southern economy was very much reliant on cash crops. Tobacco definitely being one of the biggest, and then cotton we're also going to see being one of the biggest, and rice as well. And what's important to understand here, and this is going to become actually a bigger argument when we get towards like in that 1850 time period and we're right before the Civil War, as much as the North didn't have slavery, right? When we get right before the Civil War, slavery is pretty much non-existent in the North. In a sense, the North is still benefiting off of slavery, right? Those factories that are being operated in the North are using cash crops such as cotton from the South to make their finished products. So they may not be having slavery, but they are benefiting from it. And that's an argument a lot of times that the North doesn't want to talk about, right? They don't want to talk about the fact that they're benefiting from slavery. They just want to talk about the evils of slavery. But just keep in mind, they are benefiting from it. But we are going to see a lot of things take place that are going to lead to more slavery. So if you look at, I mentioned this earlier, Eli Whitney, right? He invents the cotton gin, and that's going to make our cash crop economy just explode in the South and become extremely profitable. The machine is able to separate the seeds, which makes the whole process of harvesting the cotton move much quicker. And so what we're going to see is that farmers are going to start to want to purchase more land since they're now able to harvest this crop so quickly. And in order to do that, they're going to then ask for more slaves to work on that land. So Eli Whitney's cotton gin, an unintended consequence is that it actually leads to more slavery within our country. The market revolution also going to have an impact on slavery during this time period. Again, what I was just commenting on before, those northern factories, northern industry, they're going to demand southern cotton. And so the North is also becoming wealthy on the backs of slave labor. The North easily, if they were so against slavery, they easily could have said, we are not going to purchase cotton from you until you end slavery, right? They didn't. So we got to take the North, kind of moral attitude about how against slavery they are with a little bit of a grain of salt, because they never really did anything, in a sense, to stop it. We're also going to see an increase in cotton production, not across the South, but again, some new Western states and new Western territory that we're acquiring, we're also going to see it increasing as well. And a lot of this, again, is because the North is asking for so much cotton to be brought up to the North so they can use it to make finished products in their factory. And again, expansion of slavery is going to be taking place. We're acquiring new territories. It's going to lead to hot-button issues, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, and different compromises that have to be reached. But think about Texas, and we see Texas bringing slavery, Missouri having slavery. As we keep pushing further and further west, people are using that land to harvest cash crops, and by doing so, they want to have slaves because that makes it much more profitable to them when they can use free labor. Slavery in general, there's lots we can say about slavery and lots of ways in which we can just attempt to, right? I mean, obviously we weren't there, it's hard to do, but there are ways in which we can attempt to describe what slavery was like in a sense. A lot of people refer to it as, my screen froze for whatever reason. A lot of people refer to it as chattel slavery. What's just important to understand about slavery in general is the fact that we can generalize all we want about slavery, but no one experience was the same, right? Like all slaves who experienced slavery experienced it in a different way. The one thing we might possibly be able to generalize and say slavery had in common was the fact that not one slave wanted to be enslaved, right? No one wants to give up all their freedoms and be treated in the way that slaves were treated. So that's probably the only generalization we could possibly make about slavery. Otherwise, it's just important to understand everyone really did have a different experience when it came to slavery. As far as Harriet Beecher Stowe is concerned, she's going to write the very famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is just going to explode through the North. It's going to be published a great deal a lot of people in the North are going to read it. And when people read Uncle Tom's Cabin, they're really going to start pushing for the end of slavery. At least Northerners are going to push for the end of slavery and start asking for our government to get involved and create laws to end slavery. We don't see, again, slavery coming to an end, but they will be pushing for it. It's going to take a war, obviously, to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln, there's a funny story about when he meets Harriet Beecher Stowe. He basically says to her, "So you're the little lady who began this war," because of the fact that it inspired so many people to join the abolitionist movement and to speak out against slavery. It was actually banned in the South, the book, so that Southerners would not be allowed to read it. Important to understand, too, slaves had no social, political, or civil rights. So there were different slave codes that were put in place in the South, which made it so that slaves couldn't leave their plantation to go visit another plantation. And this was especially difficult for slave families that were being separated and sent to various plantations. The fact that they weren't allowed to visit or to see each other. And a lot of this was because they wanted to make sure slaves did not try to escape. Other slave codes that were put into place, said that slaves weren't allowed to learn to read. They weren't allowed to learn to write. And the purpose for doing that was, again, to make it difficult for slaves to be able to escape and to get anywhere. Hopefully, it's known that, of course, slaves are not really considered citizens in the sense that they have no voting rights. They have no legal rights at all. And that's just important to understand that that's how Southern society really treated them. We do see the emergence of an African-American culture during this time period of slavery, where a lot of slaves, what they wanted to do was cling to their faith as a way of helping them through such a horrible experience. And so you do see a lot of hymnals, a lot of prayers that are developed during this time period and really help to enrich the African-American culture. Again, I'm just going to take a quick break in case there are any questions. My screen, for whatever reason, has frozen. Let's see if this works or not. Just give me 1 second while I try to troubleshoot something here. I'm not sure what's happening. Okay, doesn't look like it's going to work. All right, anyway, moving on. So forms of resistance that are taking place during this time period, right? Slaves did want to try to resist slavery because they did not want to be a part of it. So these are some things that they can do in order to resist. One would be to purposely slow down their work, right? If you're slowing down your work in the fields, you're cutting into your plantation owner's profit. And for that, that was something you could do kind of as a way to resist slavery. Do you understand, like, each of these things that we talk about, like, by doing this, slaves are taking the chance that their owners might brutally abuse them or beat them for doing that. So it's not just something they could do and there were no repercussions to it. Negligence. So this could be with some of the tools you might be using in the field. Maybe you might break the tools, ruin the tools, something like that. Again, because it's going to, one, slow down your work, but two, it's also going to cut into the profits of the owner. You could run away. So one thing that slaves could try to do was try to escape to the north. We're going to see there are fugitive slave laws in place that make it difficult for slaves to escape to the north, but that was kind of an option that they did have if they were able to escape. And later on, you'll learn about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad and how that was able to help slaves. And then slave revolts. This rarely took place. We did not see a lot of slave revolts take place. Probably the most famous would be prior to our country, when we're talking about the Stono Rebellion and when slaves were trying to escape to Spanish Florida at that point in time. But slave revolts rarely took place just because they were not successful. Southerners' reaction to any of these forms of resistance, again, you'll see them brutalize their slaves, so the treatment of the slaves wouldn't be good. You might also, or I shouldn't say you might also, we also saw, things like fugitive slave laws come about, which was going to hurt the slaves, because slave laws, which again is going to make it more difficult for them to escape and make the punishments more brutal should they try to escape. And then we'll also see, as I mentioned earlier, the enactment of those different slave codes throughout the South. And those slave codes were purposely put into place to make it difficult for the slaves to want to resist. All right, I'm gonna try to, my screen keeps freezing up on me, so I apologize as that's happening. So Western expansion, and I've kind of alluded to this now a couple times, Western expansion is going to be huge as far as impacting slavery, because as we're gaining more territories, once those territories hit a certain population, a lot of them are applying for statehood. And it's very important to many people living in our country at the time that we keep a balance between the same amount of slave states and free states. Why do you think that's so important to states at this point in time, to have that balance of slave states and free states? And the big reason that that argument is even taking place is because everyone's concerned, right? If we have an unequal balance, meaning say there's more free states, that means they will have more of a say in Congress, and then the fear is they might do something to stop slavery. Take it to the other side, say we had an imbalance and there were more slave states, same thing, they would have more of a say in Congress, and then they could do something to keep slavery around. They could pass laws, I shouldn't say do something, they could pass laws to keep slavery around longer. So that's really where the fear during this time period is coming in. So just keep that in mind. So we do see, and Henry Clay is going to be the architect of a bunch of these different laws that are coming in. We do see that as territories are trying to become states, we do end up seeing the fact that compromises are going to be reached to try to stop the country from falling apart. The first of them is going to be the Missouri Compromise. This is going to be in 1820. And basically what the Missouri Compromise does, it's looking at the land that we purchased, most of the land that we purchased from the Louisiana Purchase, and what it's going to do, and Henry Clay worked out this compromise. What it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, Missouri, you're going to enter our country as a slave state. Maine, which technically was a part of Massachusetts for the longest time, it's going to say, Maine, you're going to enter the country as a free state. And then what we're going to do is we're going to draw a line, an invisible line across the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. And what we're going to say is if you fall north of that line, when you're ready to become a state, you're going to be free. If you fall south of that line, when you're ready to become a state, you're going to be slave. And so we're going to see the Missouri Compromise. This is, again, going to be in 1820. And for about 30 years, it's going to keep our country together, right? We're not going to end up in a civil war, which is a good thing. So for 30 years, Missouri Compromise is going to save the day. In a sense, right? I mean, we're talking about saving the day, but we're also still talking about the fact that we have people being brutalized with the lifestyle of slavery. So you got to take that comment, save the day, with a grain of salt. 30 years later, we're going to run into more problems. We acquire more territory from the Mexican-American War. And this is going to lead to, once again, the question of how are we going to settle these issues and making sure we have enough free states and enough slave states, right? This is going to become a huge problem. So what they decide to do is Henry Clay, at least in my class, I don't know if your teachers talk about Henry Clay all the time. I tend to talk about Henry Clay probably a little too much. But just because I find him fascinating as far as the way in which he's actually able to broker so many compromises throughout our country's history. And really, he's around for quite a long time in our country's history. But anyway, Henry Clay, what he does with the Compromise of 1850 is he makes it so that California will come in as a free state in our country. The Mexican cession land that we acquired, so think today what we know as Utah and New Mexico, they're going to just be set up as territories. So right now they're not going to be states, they're just going to be considered territories. But that means that in time, right? They're going to want to become states in time. Just at this point in time, they're not going to be. So when they do want to become states, they're going to operate under the idea of what's known as popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty basically just says that the people who live within those territories, when they're ready to become a state, they're going to get to decide whether or not they're going to be a slave or a free state. The Compromise of 1850 also bans the slave trade in D.C. Now, again, keep in mind the external slave trade is over. We're only talking about the internal slave trade is around. And so it's going to ban the internal slave trade in D.C. There will be a new, much harsher, much stronger fugitive slave law put into place. And it's also going to settle the dispute between New Mexico and Texas, with Texas giving some land to New Mexico. So the Compromise of 1850, if you look at our boundaries of Texas and New Mexico today, they come from the Compromise of 1850. So here in the Compromise of 1850, all we're seeing is the fact that we have the South and the North being appeased each through some of the different things that are being offered. And then again, 4 years later, things are going to come to a head with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, it's going to say that Kansas and Nebraska, again, are going to be operating under that idea of popular sovereignty, where they will have the option to choose the citizens within each of those territories when they're ready to become states. They'll have the option to choose whether or not they're going to be free, whether or not they're going to be slave. And this, once again, is going to lead to a lot of issues just because of the fact that we're going to see what is going to become known as Bleeding Kansas take place, where a lot of people are going to purposely move into Kansas, some Northerners, some Southerners, and it's going to lead to fighting and ugliness and kind of all of that stuff taking place. I didn't mean to skip there. So anyway, that I tried to show it in a presentation, but it's being funky right now as I do that. That ends kind of our discussion for tonight. I have practice questions. I might actually just flip and have you start reading the passage. And that way you can look at this passage and then we'll jump to the question. And again, if there's any questions as you're reading this passage, feel free to fire them away. All right, so I'm going to go right into switch to the question. So which of the following best supports that passage you were just reading? Slave owners had a special status of privilege. Many slave revolts resulted in freedom for thousands of slaves before the Civil War. Slavery was the sole cause for a single crop agricultural system. Many slaves were able to buy their freedom. So I'll give you all a second as you answer that question. All right, we got Vicky with an A, Libby with an A. You are both correct. This passage is talking about that slave owners did have a special status of privilege. Awesome job. Let's go to the second question. If you need me at all, because I know it's hard to remember the passage, to jump back to the passage, don't hesitate to ask. Criticisms of the attitudes expressed in the passage led to more and more owners selling off their slaves. Churches beginning to divide due to a dispute over whether or not slavery was justified in the Bible. Slaves rebelling for freedom more often and with more success, or more and more Southerners forming organizations help free the slaves. So do kind of process of elimination on this one too. If you're stuck, there's a couple answers that we could probably cross out from the get-go. See, so C is one that we can cross out, right? Because slave rebellions were something that was, thanks Frank, slave rebellions were rare. We didn't actually see a lot of them happening. So C is an answer we can definitely cross out. And I'm just gonna jump back to the passage for a second to give you guys some more context here. So they're really talking about ways, right, in which to keep the slaves under control, this one plantation and their rules. And they said the biggest thing here is that they don't want any of the slaves marrying out of the plantation. And so the answer for this one is actually going to end up being B. The fact that churches were beginning to divide due to a dispute over whether or not slavery was justified in the Bible. And the reason they are hoping you would go with B is the comment and the fact that where in that passage it talks about, and the biggest thing that they don't want you experiencing is marriage outside of the plantation. And marriage is alluding to religion at this point in time. And then we'll switch to the next question. So this is the last one for that passage. In the decades before the Civil War, slave owners empowered by the slave revolts became less harsh toward their slaves, provided separate villages for the slaves to come together for worship and marriage, created a set of pro-slavery arguments justifying slavery as a positive good, formed a union to prevent the abolitionists from gaining power. See, awesome. Good job, Libby. Yeah, so we're going to see people like, awesome, Vicki, John Calhoun and some other Southerners. That's going to be their big quote, that slavery was a positive good, that the way they were treating slavery or treating slaves was actually beneficial for the slaves. Similar to an argument that we saw people like the Spanish using against the Native Americans and the way in which they were treating Native Americans. Okay, this last one, this passage is super long. I'm going to try to put it in present mode for a second, just because I think it'll make it bigger. I'm hoping for you all to read it. So take a little bit to read this. There's only one question associated with this huge passage. All right, so I'm going to just jump back. Okay, and here's going to be the question for that super long passage, which also is kind of small. Let's try this again. Oh, so this right here is just the information about the passage. I couldn't fit it, but just so you can see who wrote it. It was written in 1832, and it's part of this whole pro-slavery argument, and then it was published in 1853. So the author's sentiments in the passage can best be understood as supportive of the continuation of the international slave trade, opposed to the continued restrictions against citizenship for slaves, an expression of Southern pride in the institution of slavery, an argument for the gradual emancipation of slaves. And I'm just going to flip back to the passage really quick so you can take one more look. And just give me a second. I'm going to make it big again so I can't see any comments or questions right now. Okay, so let's jump now to the question again. So Vicky's going with C, an expression of Southern pride in the institution of slavery. Yeah, that's 100% the correct answer. It's kind of sad and crazy that people actually took pride in such a system. Yep, awesome, Libby. But yeah, we do see a lot of Southern pride in the institution of slavery.